had to look up my the movie that they've been talking about. Some of you might have heard on the news about Killers of the Flower Moon. It's about the atrocities perpetrated on the Osage Indians, which is where the area where I went to high school. So it's kind of dear to my heart. Pawhuska, Oklahoma is where that the Mercantile, the pioneer woman, some of you might have seen her on TV. They have a huge following, but they're now filming this movie there with Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio, and it's kind of a big deal considering there's like 3 stores in Pawhuska. So this is a really big deal for them. But it kind of ties along with racism, not Black racism, obviously, but the Osage Indians were, you know, they were the brunt of a lot of horrible, horrible things. So if it's a good book, it's just Killers of the Flower Moon. If anyone's looking for a nice read, it'll get you upset.
I read that book. It is a great book. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
It's like one of those where you enjoy it, but go, you know, it's like the one I suggested last week about the Dust Bowl. It's, what is it? The Four Winds, Kristen Hanna's.
That's another great book.
It's like, they're good, but you're just kind of like,
they're heavy.
Gosh, this is so awful. And again,
they're difficult. Yeah.
The tail end of, I do remember my mom, I was maybe 4 or 5, and I remember my mom putting wet tea towels over my window so I could sleep and not get dust in my lungs. So yeah, it rings close to home. All right, I'll shut up.
Yeah, another great book about destroying the Indian culture is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I don't know how many of you read that, but it's horrible. When I was playing baseball in college, we still played a team in North Carolina that was on an Indian reservation. And they were very good athletes, of course, but one of the really terrible tolls is alcoholism in Indian. And we'd see kids who are only 16 years old who were alcoholics.
John has come in. Hi, John. Connecting to He's muted. See him down there?
Yep, there he is.
There you are. Hello.
It's talking to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whew. Well, it was starting to dawn on me. I was looking at the clock as Don got up to do the benediction. It was like, yeah, this is going to be a little tight. So I doing some nonverbal communication to Anne and Jenny. So thank you, Jenny, for coming over. And I don't know what you did thus far, but we do have 2 videos today. And so, you know, one is about 20 minutes, one is about 17 minutes, you know, covering 2 chapters. So I wasn't going to say too much. I'm just trying to load up this first one. You know, you forget when you have people in the room that just, there's like time that just is not accounted for in place A to place B. A welcome rediscovery today, certainly. But let me.
Jenny?
Yes.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
I missed last week, so I wondered if there's a way I can show myself the video from last week.
Lynn's been posting links so that you can watch any of the sessions that you miss.
Okay.
So she usually in the email during the week, one of the congregational emails. If you don't find it, like reach out to her and she can give you the link to it.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
Betsy, we were not there last week and we watched it on YouTube.
Right. Right.
So we've gotten it on YouTube.
Great.
So with these 2 chapters, we are moving into the middle section of the ARC acronym, Arc of Racial Justice, that the framework that Jamar Tisby is using. So we spent a few weeks in awareness. And then so with these first two chapters, we move into the section on relationships. And so this first video on how to do reconciliation right. I'm going to just go ahead and jump right into that. I'll offer a prayer, but then begin that. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking after that video before moving into the second one, how to make friends. You know, because of and this is what happened last time, you know, if we're running out of time, you know, if people want to stay on, I do need to duck out at about 12:45. But if the conversation's still going, hopefully we can help facilitate that. But yeah, so let me offer a prayer and then we'll dive into the first video. God, we are grateful for this time and for just this group that's gathered around this study. And as we move into thematically, just realizing and looking at the way in which we are wired for relationship, both with you and with our neighbor, and that there has been a lot of brokenness in the ways that we have interacted with neighbor historically and even in the present. And so as we move through this, give us wisdom as we watch the video and in our discussion together, maybe learn from one another. We pray in Christ's name, amen. As I go to share my screen and start the video, just invite you to put yourself on mute for the duration of the video, and then we'll come back for the discussion. And just a quick question, are you seeing the video area full screen, or are you seeing a bunch of other extraneous stuff on my screen?
I'm seeing it full screen.
Full screen.
Okay, great. Excellent. Here we go.
The second letter in our acronym, ARC of Racial Justice, stands for relationships. So let's talk about relationships, and let's talk about the importance of reconciliation in relationships as we fight racism. I remember some years back, I was at a special gathering of church members. We were getting together in someone's home because another unarmed Black person had been shot and killed by a police officer. Unfortunately, so many human beings' names have become hashtags. I don't remember what specific incident this was, but I do remember that gathering. As we sat in this person's living room, people splayed out on couches, the floor, and leaning on end tables. There was a Black and white couple. One couple was Black, one couple was white, and they had developed a friendship over the years. One time when they were socializing, the Black couple brought up the talk they had to have with their kids. Now, this wasn't the sex talk. This was the talk that many Black parents have to give to their children about how to survive an encounter with the police. This particular couple had 2 teenage Black sons, and having the talk with them entailed tips like turn on the dome light if it's at night, keep both hands on the wheel, always move slowly, tell the officer what you're doing first, record if you can. Now, these may be best practices in general, but for a Black person, any misstep, any mistake, any misinterpreted action could end up fatal. And the white couple, reflecting on hearing about this talk, thought to themselves and expressed their surprise. You see, they too had teenage sons, but neither of them were Black. And so the idea of having this talk with them had never occurred to them. To them, the police had always been this benevolent presence. They're the ones you go to and ask for help. And it was through this personal relationship that this white couple learned about some of the burdens of Black people when it comes to racial injustice. Now, don't get me wrong, it is not the role of Black people solely to serve as the educators for white people. But what was interesting is that this couple's awareness increased through a personal relationship. Oftentimes, in order for the data, the statistics, the graphs, the charts to make sense, to be human, you actually have to know a flesh and blood person. That's what I want to talk about. The importance of reconciliation and relationships when it comes to racial justice. One essential understanding as we talk about how to do reconciliation right is understanding that all reconciliation is relational. Within a Christian framework, when God wanted to reconcile with human beings, God didn't send a TikTok video or a tweet. God sent his son, Jesus Christ, a human being. In religious terms, Christ, God, became incarnate, took on flesh. Why? To develop real relationships with real people so that we could be reconciled both to God and to one another. And within that principle is this idea that all reconciliation is relational. At some point, all of the data, all of the statistics, everything that we hear about race has to take on a human face. The other has to become our brother or sister. They have to become real beings that we can feel empathy for and express solidarity with. That's what it means that all reconciliation is relational. We can never neglect the importance of personal relationships in pursuing reconciliation and racial justice. Another essential understanding in doing reconciliation right is that very word, reconciliation. When it comes to race, it would be reasonable to ask, when have we ever been conciled? When has there ever been conciliation between the races, especially Black and white people? When is this bygone era that we're supposed to return to as a reconciliation? Now, I understand the concern, but I don't think we should give up on that word reconciliation. For one, there was a time when all things were reconciled. Just depends on how far back you go. In the biblical story in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, there was harmony between God and human beings and one another. On another level, reconciliation doesn't have to do with chronology at all. Maybe reconciliation refers not to a particular time period, but to a particular pattern. The pattern that God established for a relationship between human beings, a pattern of harmony, a pattern of mutual love and respect. And in that sense, we can talk about reconciliation as a return to what God intended for human beings to do and how to act toward one another. Lastly, we can't give up on the word reconciliation because we can't give up on the biblical concept of reconciliation or our responsibility to be reconciled to one another. In the Bible, it says that Jesus gave us the ministry of reconciliation. This is a Bible word. This is a gospel word. This is a good news word. We are to carry the good news, this message that God has reconciled God's self to people through the person and work of Jesus Christ. And we are to carry that reconciliation between God and human beings to the reconciliation between human beings and one another. It's a ministry that we have, particularly as people of faith. Now, I know some people listening may not be Christian, may not be particularly religious at all, but I think it's still important to understand the religious dimensions of reconciliation. If for no other reason, then you begin to understand how other people, many other people, especially in the United States, understand reconciliation. It'll help you grasp where other people are coming from and maybe even help further the conversation about reconciliation right where you are. Another essential understanding we must have is implied. If we're talking about doing racial reconciliation right, then that presumes that there's a way to do racial reconciliation wrong. Now, if we look at what I would call the modern racial reconciliation movement, began sometime maybe in the early 90s, continued on at least up through the early 2010s, I would say. In the 90s, you get this sort of watershed of events. In 1995, on the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention, the denomination finally repented of its pro-slavery origins. They passed a resolution that said, "We lament and repudiate historic acts of evil such as slavery, from which we continue to reap a bitter harvest. And we recognize that the racism which yet plagues our culture today is inexplicably tied to the past." And they connected an action to it. They said, "We hereby commit ourselves to eradicate racism in all its forms from Southern Baptist life and ministry." Similarly, in 1996, the Promise Keepers movement held a huge rally in Atlanta. Their theme was "Break Down the Walls," and it was based on Ephesians 2:14, which said, "For he himself," meaning Jesus Christ, "is our peace, who has made the two groups one," meaning Jew and Gentile, "and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." They used that verse as motivation for racial reconciliation. And there was this dramatic moment where the leaders of the conference invited down all of the black people. And on the way, they were hugging and reconciling with white people. They were crying, and this lasted for 45 minutes or more. And for many people, it was the most memorable part of the rally. In 2012, the Southern Baptist Convention finally elected its first black president, Fred Luter. Signs of change are all over the place. If we look at multi-ethnic churches, that is, churches where no single racial or ethnic group comprises more than 80% of the total congregation, those have increased. One study says that Protestant churches tripled from 4 to 12% between 1998 and 2012 in terms of those considered multi-ethnic. So if you look at the data, it appears there's great progress being made in terms of racial reconciliation. But if you peel back the layers, you notice some problems. First, the problem, I think, is fundamentally a misdiagnosis of the problem. Too many people conceive of the problem of race as one of separation between people of different races and ethnicities. And so if the problem is separation, then the solution is desegregation. I say desegregation because of the second problem with racial reconciliation as it has often been practiced. And the second problem is that it often excludes any notion of power dynamics within relationships. And so diversity and desegregation are two different things. So modern racial reconciliation movements often neglect the issue of power. So it's great that you might have people of color within your fellowship or your organization. But how is political, economic, and cultural power exercised? Unless we understand these dynamics, then merely changing the demographics isn't going to do much. It's going to result in tokenism. What we have to do is move toward equity, where everyone has a seat at the table, but they also have a voice at the table too, where their opinions and their perspectives matter. And there's another problem with modern day racial reconciliation movements. It often neglects or downplays the issue of gender. The scholar Shaniqua Walker Barnes wrote a book called "I Bring the Voices of My People," and in it she writes, "Women, particularly women of color, have largely been invisible in the field of reconciliation." Let's be honest, racial reconciliation, as many Christians have practiced it, benefits mostly white men and men of color. What about women of color? What about black women? Now, I wish I had more time to get into the gender dynamics here, but let it be said that any racial reconciliation movement that does not also consider gender and the role of women in reconciliation is bound to fail. So how can we do racial reconciliation right? The racial justice practices I'm about to share pertain mainly to communities of faith and to churches, but I think they're applicable broadly. Number one, incorporate lamentation into worship. I have lived most of my adult life in the Mississippi River Delta, and it is a region that birthed a novel form of music called the blues, named after the so-called blue notes, these somber notes on a keyboard. And it expresses the pain and the dismay and the sadness of life. And it sounds very sad, almost morose kind of music, but at the same time, it's cathartic. Putting words to your pain helps you process that pain. In the Bible, blues music might be called the music of lamentation. In fact, there's a whole book of the Bible called Lamentations. And if you look to the Psalms and some of the themes in the Psalms, much of it is lamentation. And so when it comes to racial justice, one of the things that we need to do in order to do reconciliation right is lament how we've done reconciliation wrong for so long and in so many ways. So how can we lament, particularly in the context of, say, a worship service or some sort of spiritual gathering? Well, of course, we can pray about it, but we can pray specifically. Say the names of the women and men who were killed unjustly. Name the people who have been affected by injustice and racism. Another way we can incorporate lamentations is to confess the ways that our community, our congregation has failed when it comes to racial justice, to talk about the silence, the apathy, the passivity, or sometimes even the overt acts that have contributed to racism and the oppression of people of color. As we're speaking about confession, many people might object, well, listen, I was not alive during slavery. I did not segregate in my business or my practices. Why am I confessing for the sins of people who came before me? Well, I think there's biblical precedent for this, for communities acknowledging the wrongdoings of the people who came before them, acknowledging the wrongdoing of their ancestors. In the book of Ezra, the prophet Ezra implored Yahweh's forgiveness. And in chapter 9 says, I am too ashamed and disgraced, my God, to lift up my face to you, because our sins are higher than our heads, and our guilt has reached the heavens. From the days of our ancestors until now, our guilt has been great. That language is really important. Ezra uses inclusive language, we and our. He includes himself in this confession and this lamentation. And he says, from the days of our ancestors, meaning he is confessing for the things that people who came before him did, acknowledging that community is important. Why do we confess, even for the things we may not have personally perpetuated? Because communities outline the boundaries of our morals and ethics. They tell us what's okay and what's not okay. And so in a sense, we are all implicated in the community because we are all part of setting that standard for what is permissible regarding race and what is impermissible. Even though each person is responsible for their own actions, our sense of morality and our conscience is shaped by community. Another racial justice practice, again, pertains to history. Do a history of your local congregation, especially if your church has been around since, I'd say, the 70s or the 80s on back. You probably have a very interesting racial past as a congregation. If you're a predominantly white church, it may be some sad, disappointing information that you may have to go back and confess and repent of. For historically black congregations or congregations made up of people of color, you may find a rich history of activism and involvement that you can celebrate and promote and use as motivation for further action in the present. But look at your own faith community, your own spiritual community, and see how it has been shaped and formed by its history. Another racial justice practice that churches can practice is to go back and be reconciled with the people who have been harmed by racism. One of the things I'm burdened by is when I see a church, a congregation finally start to come to terms with their own racism, but they only talk about what they're going to do moving forward and what's going to happen in the future. They haven't recognized that they have left a trail of damaged, wounded, and traumatized people in the past. So part of reconciling means confessing and also going back to the people who have been harmed and acknowledging what you've learned, acknowledging what you've done. It's not just about what you're going to do next or what you're going to do and move forward to in the future. It's about going back and recognizing that your delay has caused real damage to some people and making sure they know that you confess, lament, and repent of it. Racial reconciliation, particularly in a church context, must include preaching about reconciliation. Again, you never want to assume that an elder board, trustees, or a congregation knows what they need to know, particularly from a Christian perspective, about race, ethnicity, and reconciliation. So you got to talk about it. Do it from the pulpit. Do it in Sunday schools and Bible studies. Make sure your people know. How exactly do you preach about reconciliation? Well, there's a great preacher named Frank A. Thomas. He wrote a book, How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon. And he said, here are some tips for preaching a prophetic sermon. He said, where in this text do we find equality envisioned and represented by physical presence? Where in this text do we notice empathy as a catalyst or a bridge to create opportunities to overcome the past and make new decisions for peace and justice? He said, where do we find wisdom and truth in this ancient text, the wisdom of ages? Where is the language of poetry and art that lifts and elevates by touching the emotive chords of wonder, hope, and mystery? And to what contemporary moral concern would you apply your responses to these 4 questions? That's just one guide, one template. What it's basically saying is, as a preacher or teacher probes the Bible for lessons and applications, pay attention to justice, pay attention to peace, pay attention to reconciliation, and you can apply it even to our modern day issues of racial justice. As we're talking about racial reconciliation done right, and particularly in the context of the church, it remains a lamentable truth. There would be no black church without racism in the white church. The reality is, as churches, we must confess, lament, and repair the damage done by racism. If we want to do reconciliation right, then we must accept the responsibility of coming to grips with these truths and building relationships based on truth and not a lie.
A lot there, certainly that to dive into. I wanted to begin with this theme of reconciliation, and he offers both in the essential understandings, but also in some of these practices, some thoughts and some ideas on that, based on the chapter, if you read it, or on the video as he presented this material. What do you hear as he's describing it? What do you hear as what racial reconciliation means or looks like? Or perhaps if you want to take it from the other side of it, what does racial reconciliation not mean or not look like? And I trying to see if I can get. I see Kathy, and if yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
I was just gonna say that it doesn't look like just giving a quick mention, like a 1-minute little announcement in a worship service, and thinking that that's enough, because that's not enough. It has to be more unpacked and lived out throughout the church, and it has to, I think, be incorporated into the fabric of the pastoral staff and the life of the church.
Right. Yeah, and then we'll go Kimmel's. Not sure whose big statement that is.
I was so struck by his citing Ezra and the responsibility that, in a sense, we have to seek to undo the whole history that lies behind us, not just our personal responsibility. And I think throughout the book, he continues to emphasize that this is a community project as well as an individual project. And as I've learned more about white privilege over the last year or so, I've come to recognize, even though I did not see myself as in a privileged position just by my race, I've enjoyed benefits in this society, as did my parents and grandparents, etc. So I think taking, the longer historical look and the broader communal look is very important.
Yeah, I agree. The kind of in response to the question, because probably, I've certainly experienced this objection of like, why do I have to confess or apologize for things that happened before I was ever alive? And so I think as people of faith, him providing that example from scripture, a very poignant example, I really resonated with. I saw, so we'll go Sue Kelly and then Chris Clark.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, and generally, I think of, what not to do is business as usual and to look at different parts of our lives. But I do believe that the past is living with us and that we have personal responsibility to react to the standards of the norm and to stand up and speak when we see something that should not be happening, doing, or said. And that can be done with love and as a Christian. And also that I really, really appreciate that we're in the relationship part right now, relationship and bridge building. It just seems to me that working toward personal empathy with a flesh and blood human being that has a different background than ours, Black, Indigenous, person of color, Asian, whoever is, someone you can meet, perhaps connect with, look into their eyes and say, hi, I'm Sue, whatever. So relationship building is huge, I think. And I'm so glad we're looking at that now.
Great, thank you, Sue. And then Chris, and then we'll move on to another question here.
Yeah, I guess this kind of adds on a little bit, but I just think reconciliation has memory. And I think sometimes, as he described, some reconciliation movements often want to move past the memory of, what has happened, just say, let's just get along. Can we just move forward? And I think, that's what I took from it. It has this memory, not to just hang over our heads and say, oh, how bad we are, but to remind us of the past. Because I think he said maybe last week that, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. So yeah, I just think of it as something that should hold memory if we're going to do it well.
Great.
And I think I love that, because I think, bringing up that there's a past to these issues, and I think to transition into the first practice that he mentions, which I think really for those, if I'm just looking around quickly, but the women's circle study this year in the church was all about lament, and the first practice that he mentions in this chapter and in the video is to lament. And I think that you can lament things in the past, but some of the examples that he gave, what was about lamenting what's happening right before you. So perhaps naming names of victims of injustice. There's a quote that I had underlined: if you have not learned to lament, this was on page 93. If you've not learned to lament, you have not learned to love. And I think in this relational context, can you imagine if you went through a tragedy, someone in your family died, and like a friend or said nothing, offered nothing, was vacant, was absent, and I think that can be the experience when these types of things, particularly in say a context in a predominantly white church, if nothing is ever named, nothing is lamented, I mean, that sends a clear message to any folks that might be part of the community that, and that statement really stuck out to me, that if we're not lamenting the things that our neighbors, the ones that we say we want to be reconciled to and with, then we're sending a different message with our actions than we are with our words. Maybe Marjorie, do you have?
I think one of the most challenging aspects of his description of relationships is the reckoning with the economic and cultural deprivation and cost that is also a part of our relationship. And his description of a total community and its definition of our moral sensibilities is one in which it seems to me there are just enormous implications beyond the church's traditional emphasis on a personal relationship. I don't think that he is by any means devaluing a personal relationship, but he is defining relationships in a far more complex consciousness than just getting along or doing well or even lamenting that there are economic and political implications for these relationships that are very real, very challenging, and to me, very confusing.
Yeah. And, at the outset, I know I said we have a couple of videos today, and definitely not enough time to do either chapter justice. I think, if anything, I think these chapters, including maybe the last chapter of the last section, really, I thought touched on some things that we've talked about, in the church. I mean, for a time, before COVID, we had some folks looking into, session records and just the documents, the historical documents of the church, to try to do some of that, auditing of our history, of our racial history, and like what did the session, or what was preached about, the Sunday after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated? What was that in the prayer? I mean, if we could kind of get to stuff like that. Now that work had begun and was just, with COVID and just, not entering the building, that work was not able to go forward as, as it had been. And, that's something that I know we're all eager to make happen again. But even touching on things that we can do in worship, like lament, but absolutely, Marjorie, there was a section, I don't know if it's the same section you're talking about, but on page 96, after he used the example of Ezra confessing on behalf of the people before the exile who were no longer around, he talks about the fact that every community sets the boundaries for what beliefs and actions are deemed acceptable. And that is indeed complicated and hard work. But if there's anything I can if I could summarize, what I sort of took out of this chapter in all of what it talks about: reconciliation, power dynamics. The only way I think you can work through some of that stuff is with long-term, humility and honesty in relationships. To me, I saw a lot of parallels in some of the language that's changed in the last couple of decades around mission partnerships. A lot of similar things I think are at play, certainly power dynamics and the idea that, it's not just about getting people together and, having these big, symbolic foot washings and then everything's like all good and there's no more, there's no more strife among neighbors. But this invitation to go deeper and to do it for the long haul and to do it together. If you have something else that is in your mind from this chapter, if you can jot it down or hang on to it, I do want to start the second video, which in some ways continues this conversation on how to make friends. So let me pull that up and invite you to mute again as we watch this. This is about 17 minutes.
How to make friends. I remember a few years ago, I was part of a group that was co-sponsoring a seminar at a large Christian conference. The title of the seminar was called Doing Racial Harmony, and one of my pastor friends named Thabiti Anyabwile, he had a section entitled The Do's and Don'ts of Racial Reconciliation. What he said in that brief presentation was so simple, yet so profound. He said that every one of us at 3 or 4 or 5 years old used to go up to people and say, "Will you be my friend?" And what happened? He answered his own question. We made friends. Somewhere along the way, we made it more complicated as we got older. Thabiti put it this way. He said, at some point we stopped doing that, asking, "Will you be my friend?" because it became weird. I just think we should go back to being weird and say, hey, listen, I offer you friendship. I agree. If we want to make friends, if relationships are so important to reconciliation and racial justice, then at some point we have to simplify it. We have to make that step and make that move and just say, I offer you friendship. As we talk about friendship, there are some essential understandings. The watchword in making friends across racial and ethnic lines is humility, not utility. Humility, not utility. That means each and every person, because of the fact that they're made in the image of God and the likeness of God, they're worthy of getting to know just for being human, just to learn their stories, just to be in relationship with people. And human beings are not people you can sort of collect just to hear about race. Here's what I mean. Ask yourself this question. Would I still be friends with this person even if the topic of race never came up? Humility, not utility. Another essential understanding in making friends across racial and ethnic lines is that these conversations are not new to Black people and people of color. We have had this conversation about race, about our racial experiences, about racial history over and over and over again. And so, if you're a person in the racial majority, be prepared to hear the word no or not yet. That means we're not ready at this particular moment to talk about this. And that may not be personal to you. It's just that we're tired. We're tired because every day we deal with racism and white supremacy, and every day may not be the day when we can unpack that for you. Another essential understanding to having these cross-cultural friendships and relationships is to understand that racism is felt. This is not an abstract intellectual concept that we can debate. This is visceral. This is felt. When Black people and other people of color talk about race, we are uncovering old wounds, old traumas. It comes with smells and tastes and touch. And so to reveal that once again is difficult. And I think we need to bear in mind that when we approach the topic of race with other people, especially racial and ethnic minorities, we need to approach it from a standpoint of empathy and solidarity and listening with an open mind. Some people I've interacted with about race, they sort of approach the topic like you're debating whether the movie Die Hard is a Christmas movie or not. It's an amusing conversation, but it's probably not going to affect your day-to-day life that much. Race is not like that. It is a deep, sensitive topic, and we need to approach it with the humility and respect that it deserves. Now, when it comes to actually making friends across racial and ethnic lines, there are a few practices that we can employ. Number one, do your homework first. Have you ever tried to talk about race online or on social media? I don't recommend it. In addition to the trolls that are just there to make life miserable for people, There are a lot of people who will chime in and make a comment out of their ignorance. They haven't done their basic homework to figure out the dynamics of race and racism in this country. And so, one of my favorite answers to any question about race is just two simple words: Google it. We live in the information age. Knowledge about racism, white supremacy, history has never been more accessible. What I also say is this: own your ignorance. Own your ignorance, by which I mean take the responsibility to inform yourself. You know, it's really hard to have a conversation with someone who hasn't taken the basic step and put in the minimum effort to just inform themselves on common knowledge and some essential understandings. So, if you want to have deep, rich, cross-cultural friendships, make sure you're entering into that relationship with a minimum basic level of knowledge that shows that you have some investment in this relationship. Another racial justice practice, as we are thinking about relationships across racial and ethnic lines, is to simplify it. Remember when I was talking about that message that said, you know, when we were kids, all we did was ask, can we be friends? I think we need to recover that. I'll never forget one of my very best friends who is white. We were in seminary together, and it was early on in the class. People were still getting to know each other. After class one day, he walked up to me and said, "Hey man, do you drink beer?" I was taken aback. I didn't know if he was asking me out on a date or trying to recruit me into a pyramid scheme. It turned out he was just trying to get to know me. He just wanted to be friends. Well, we hung out, and sure enough, we became friends. And in a way, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. We can go to people and say, I offer you friendship, and invite them into a relationship with us. It takes some initiative, it takes some getting over that fear, but try it. You never know how deep and rich a friendship can be if you just ask. Now, it might be a cause for some confusion as you think about, who should I ask to be a friend? Start close to you. Start with your own networks, maybe your neighbors, where you live, maybe coworkers or associates, the people you already interact with on a regular basis. There are a lot of people who are acquaintances, but we're not really friends. Why not ask them? And then, when you do have this relationship, have this friendship, how do you broach the topic of race? After all, it's a very sensitive topic. I said before, people may not want to talk about it. Again, depending on the relationship and the context, sometimes being direct is the best route. Tell someone, hey, I'm looking to be more sensitive about racial issues. I'm looking to learn different perspectives that I may not see. Would you be willing to talk to me about your experiences? Again, be prepared for people to say no, but oftentimes you'd be surprised how willing folks are to talk when you approach in the right manner. Now, I will say this, don't ambush people with a racial conversation. If you ask someone out for coffee or lunch and you bring up race, they may not be expecting to talk about this deep, heavy, personal topic. Their reaction may be, hey dude, I was just ordering a salad. Why do we have to get into this? So you may want to be upfront. Say, hey, can we talk about this specific issue? If not, that's fine, we'll just hang out. Another racial justice practice involves actually putting yourself in a position to encounter people who are different from you. Many of us live in racially and ethnically homogenous bubbles, especially if you're in the racial majority. And so how do you burst that bubble, get beyond your comfort zone, and meet people who are different? Well, you got to break up your patterns. You got to do things a little bit differently. So for instance, instead of joining a private gym for your exercise or your workouts, go to a public one, go to a community center or a YMCA where you'll encounter people from the community. If you're a Christian, instead of getting involved in the church league sports team, why not get involved in the community sports team where you'll meet lots of different people? Here's one that requires a bit of courage. Change where you get your hair cut or where you go to a beauty salon. You know, black barbershops are an institution. If you want to learn about Black culture, anything from music to politics to sports, it's all on the table at the barber shop. And by the way, if you're worried about your haircut, understand that people of color and Black people, whenever we go to a barber that's not Black, we're always worried about this. So this is a chance for you to experience some of that discomfort as well. But the payoff is that you will encounter people who are racially and ethnically different. Now, you're not there to invade or colonize that space, but to listen and to learn and to hopefully approach people on a human level and develop some relationships there. So far, we've been talking about how to develop relationships across racial and ethnic lines. But oftentimes, we'll encounter people who we already know who are what I call racial justice resistors. These are people who come up with every reason, every excuse, every argument and counter-argument not to get on the path toward racial justice. What do you do about them? Can you maintain friendships and relationships with them? Well, I'll say forthrightly, sometimes no, you can't. People are where they are, and we actually need to respect people enough to let them rest in their convictions. Our job is to present a different way, a better way, how to fight racism, and let them decide for themselves. But occasionally, you will want to interact with a racial justice resistor. And so the question is, how do you do it? Well, I lean on some experts. Emma Frances Bloomfield is an assistant professor of communication studies at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and she gives 3 considerations to help you evaluate how to approach people with whom you disagree. First, you have to decide whether the topic is worth engaging. How well do you know this person? How much do you interact? It's going to be a very different calculation with some random person on social media versus someone in your family or your church or a coworker who you'll see every day. Not everyone who's a racial justice resistor is someone you should interact with because you don't have a deep enough relationship. Second, Bloomfield says, don't patronize people. You know, people can detect patronizing, condescending remarks. They can hear it in your tone as well as your words. And so even if you vehemently disagree with someone, they're image bearers too. We have to treat them with dignity and respect. That doesn't mean agreeing with their arguments, but that does mean disagreeing in a respectful manner. And third, Bloomfield advises that you offer to trade information. So she gives the example of trying to communicate with a climate change denier. This person offered her a book or an article to read, and she said, sure, I'll read what you recommend if you read what I recommend. And that served as a jumping off point to further conversation. I'll say this, if the person is a Christian and they are somehow resistant to this idea of racial justice, I would recommend starting with the Bible. Ostensibly, the Bible is a resource that they trust and rely on, that they try to live by. And so going to the Word of God may diffuse some of their defenses. You can do something like walk through the biblical theology of race like we did in a previous segment, but start with something familiar. From there, you might be able to go on and talk about history. History has these uncomfortable facts that are hard to wiggle out from under once you present them, especially with primary source documents from the actors themselves. And from there, they're just going to have to make a decision. They can say that this information is false or not factual. They can deny the truth of it, or they can wrestle with it and hopefully change. One thing I want us to remember is that ultimately, racial justice resistance, people who are opposed to the very idea of racial justice as I'm explaining it in this series, it's not primarily an intellectual issue. I'm persuaded that it's a spiritual issue. The Bible puts it like this. It says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers in this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. What does that mean? It means you can stack facts from floor to ceiling, and it won't persuade someone. We have to pray for people. We have to intercede for people. We have to recognize that what we're dealing with goes beyond just the informational level to the spiritual level, to the soul level. I think that gives us a little bit more patience, perhaps some more perseverance in talking to racial justice resistors. The last racial justice practice is really, really important, especially for racial and ethnic minorities. Find your community or make one. We cannot be on this journey of racial justice alone. We cannot fight a solo fight against racism. Now, if you're a person of faith, hopefully you find this community in your local church. But to be honest, if you are a person of color in a predominantly white church, it may be difficult to find. And so the unfortunate truth is that as long as there is racism in white churches, I think there's always going to be a need for ethnic-specific churches. And that may be a healthy move for you to be in a predominantly black church or a predominantly Asian American church or whatever it might be. And it's not about self-segregating. It's not about retreating from society. It's about being in a place that affirms your identity without question, so that you're strengthened to go back into a society where you are a racial or ethnic minority and interact in positive ways. I also have to say that sometimes we can't find that community locally. So guess what? We got to make one. We've got to craft it for ourselves. In these difficult racial times, my lifeline has been group text messages. It's not the ideal, but it's something. So if it's not there, make it. The arc of racial justice compels us to pursue relationships across racial and ethnic lines. Don't give up on the power of friendship. Don't give up on the power of relationship in this fight against racism.
Yeah, so what in this section, what challenged or what provoked you, resonated with you from this section, how to make friends?
Ann McNally here. Can you hear me, John?
Yep.
I really liked the his opening takeaway that it's about honesty, not utility. Because I was telling a friend of mine the other day after I read this chapter that we shouldn't make friends with people of different cultures because we want to just because we want to learn from them, but more because we want to have a relationship. And I said to this person who's a person of color that I wanted to make sure that she understood that my friendship with her was honest and true, and was not just about her helping me feel better about my maybe mistreatment of people of color. So, but I didn't know how to express it well, and he just did it for me. Humility, not utility.
Yeah.
And the other thing was making an investment. I think it, he's calling us to make an investment in a real relationship. Again, not utility.
Right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Certainly, I think this this chapter, and maybe just in the way of conceptualizing it, I mean, this one I thought almost you can almost think of specific relationships that maybe we have, whereas in the first chapter that began this section with concepts like reconciliation, and there was a focus on community. So yeah, I think this one might lend itself to thinking in terms of specific relationships. Yeah, Kimmels.
Just building on what Ann said, the other word besides relationship, not utility, it was humility. And I think that applies obviously to all of our relationships in a way, but particularly we're so inclined with someone who's having a difficult time to say, oh, I understand. Well, honestly, we probably don't. We've not, if I say that to someone who's lost a spouse, I don't understand. I've not been through that experience. And I think that same lack of experience of what a Black person or a Latino has gone through, I have to be humble and say, I really don't know your experience, but I'm, sympathetic. I'd like to hear anything you want to share, but humility is a word we underrate in the United States, and I think we need to reclaim it.
Yeah, and to be able to say to someone, to a friend perhaps, a friend that has a different experience in the world, to say, I acknowledge that I'm gonna, like, I'm gonna not get it, from time to time, but I'm hoping and I'm open to learning and to even being corrected, and hopefully the relationship is such that there's a safe place for some of those conversations. I think Betsy, I believe, saw your hand up.
Well, I'm a family systems person, and I'm a contextual therapy person, which is a guy, by the name of Martin Buber and Maury Friedman and all those guys that are, all about relationships. So this really hit me, this whole segment. One of the things I wanted to say was, there's a thing called family loyalty. And we are loyal to those things that we were handed down by our family. And sometimes those things weren't great. And it doesn't mean that we're bashing our past or our family or, what we were taught. It means that we're beginning to understand somebody else's family system. And that's a great thing. And that's disloyalty to our family system, which is a good thing sometimes. It sounds bad, but it's really good. A simple thing, just to illustrate that, was a woman who made a meatloaf in a pan, and she always did it this way. And her daughter then, did it, and her husband said, why are you doing it that way? She said, well, my mother did it that way. Well, maybe his mother didn't put it in the pan. His mother just put it on the cookie sheet and baked it. And that's family loyalty. Okay. And it doesn't mean that one way was wrong and one way was right. It means that, there are different ways to come to these things. So when you learn to do something a different way, it's a good thing. And the other piece I think that I wanted to say was about entitlement. We as white folks have an entirely different understanding of what entitlement is than Black folks. We have been given, because of the history of this country, a certain thing that we feel we deserve or we should have. And whereas the Black folks in our country or people of color have been not permitted some of those things. And we have to begin to understand that and how that functions. And so I think those are very important things in relationship to begin to understand. One of the best things that I've done is go to a Black barbershop with my 3 grandsons. Let me tell you, it ain't like going to any hairdresser I've ever been to. It was one of the most rewarding experiences that I've been to hear those people back and forth talk and go, talk about things. And then in the middle of the whole thing, here comes a lady in with a whole big thing of macaroni and cheese for everybody and the whole thing. I've never been to a hairdresser like that. And I bet you haven't either. So, what our experiences are really, really kind of color, what we think. And we as white people, if something like that happened, we'd all go, oh my God, so it's a different thing. Anyway, that's a little bit about some of my feelings about relationship. And there's a lot more.
Before moving on, I didn't see it earlier when I was sharing my screen. I did see Chris added the comment just in our conversation about looking back into our history, and it's not just about looking back into history around the civil rights era, but yeah, what were the conversations that were taking place even as the Black Lives Matter got started in more recent memory? So, you know, history not just of like past decades and decades in the past, but also in recent memory. Certainly there's been a lot in our own time, you know, happening. That I think, Betsy, that's a good, just kind of reminding of you know, this, a lot of the direction in this section, you know, and even the title, How to Make Friends. I mean, it sounds very straightforward. So that's what he talks about, going into the community, where you're putting yourself into positions where you're going to be able to interact. So yeah, like, you know, the barbershop, you know, kind of things like that. I mean, there was a quote that really stuck out to me on 110, page 110, that our society's been deliberately constructed to keep white people segregated from people of color. And so it's possible for many white people to live their lives without any meaningful interaction with racial and ethnic minorities. And so let me grab, I saw Carol, I see you have your hand up, and then we'll do just a question in that direction. But yeah, Carol, what did you want to say?
I'm sort of struggling with him. I feel like I could get him in a room and argue for quite some time. I mean, he does sort of slap me in the face and make me realize there's so many things I have not done. One I wanted to mention was, if people have seen, I think it's on CNN, People and the Klan, People versus the Klan, or People and the Klan. It's a great series that's out now, and horrifies me because there was a particular incident in 1981. Now, to me, that's recent history. I know to a lot of you weren't born, but that just seems, you know, it's amazing that there were still so many issues that I sort of ignored. One of the thoughts that I had when he was talking is, I feel like he feels he's the bottom of the rung, like everyone needs to apologize, or that, that's not the right word. I guess I feel like, particularly because my history with Indians and growing up in Oklahoma and Texas, does he feel like he has a need to apologize to the Lenape tribe, because even though his parents, or even though he didn't move the people out, his parents and grandparents, you know, they all you know, necessitated that a lot of the Native Americans were pushed out, and in fact obliterated. There's a lot of tribes we don't even have now. And I feel like he's sort of saying, no, it's just us. So just, I don't know, I'm frustrated with that. The other question I had to the group is, when were we ever reconciled? I mean, we go back to Ezra. When did people not ever enslave each other? It's, to my reading or history, it's always been that way. It's always somebody, the Arabs, the Israelis, the, you know, Hondurans, the Ecuadorians, like there's always been people that have been horrible to each other. And that I feel like it's not, for some reason, when I hear him speak, it's always the whites enslaved the blacks. And in reality, the blacks enslaved the blacks, the Egyptians, you know. So I just feel like I don't know. I unfortunately, I don't have the book. I only have the audio, so I can't go back and look. Okay, yes.
I think the point of this is that we don't have to be that way. That's part of the family systems. That's part of why Christ came. We don't have to be that way. We can change it up. We're not stuck in that family loyalty or that whole thing that we have to do it that way because it was always done that way. We can change. We can all of a sudden receive this knowledge and go, hey, wow, that wasn't right. Let's do it different. And that's, I think, the point I was trying to make. I'm sorry I jumped in here on you, John, but I really wanted to address that, because I think with all these different minorities that we have in this country, it doesn't matter if you're indigenous or if you're Asian or whatever you are. We've done this as a country, and it's time to like get woke, wake up. Hey, that's not okay. And as Christians, I think he's saying we got to kind of lead the way here, folks, because we know, we get it, that we're all in Christ, that we are all equal in God's eyes, not any one group because of economics or ethnic, whatever. We all are together as Christians, and let's go there. And sorry, I just had to jump in there.
No, that's fine. Yeah, let me, Don, I saw your hand come up.
I think, Carol, you named, the wide range of slavery, which has happened in civilizations, since the beginning of time. What's unique about slavery in this country is it's based on a manufactured thing, skin color. And you said white on white, black on black, and this country, that country. Most slavery in history was, when you conquered somebody and you took their people as slaves. American slavery is uniquely in a lot of history. I mean, I'm sure there's others, but it is focused solely on skin color, and what the outworkings of that have been the denial of the humanity of a whole group of people purely based on their racial identity, which is a fabrication of human beings anyway. But it's something we made up. And so instead of it being you conquered somebody, not that any kind of slavery is good, but it's such a different one than you would see in other places where you conquered, you took over the people, and they became your servants. And it had nothing to do with their skin color. It had to do with the fact that you won, you beat them, and you owned them. And this has perpetuated an attitude toward a people simply because of race, which is what makes it just different than so much other examples of slavery.
Yeah, and a comment was just entered into chat from Joni and Andrea, and I think a worthy one to lift up. Jamar is speaking from a particular context, and throughout the book, I mean, he didn't necessarily go into it in great detail in the video. He does cite the fact that we, all of us need to hear from one another's experiences, and listening to him elsewhere in podcasts. I mean, he talks about the fact that, I don't see Carol yet, whose question I was responding to. Yeah, this has only happened when I'm leading. Somebody, I just need to put a sticky note, make yourself the host. But
John, you need to ask to be the host whenever you join a meeting.
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you imagine if this happened in real life? If just people were just taken from
The
meetings?
rapture.
Yeah.
It sort of goes with Don's message this morning.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
I don't know. I don't know if Carol will get back.
Don walking out the door. Yeah.
I don't know if she's gonna get back on or not. But I mean, certainly there's other experiences. Oh, there she is. There's Carol.
She's trying.
Connecting to audio. So Carol, yeah, I don't remember. I was in the middle of some sentence. I think Joni or Andrea had left a comment.
I can't type it again.
I'm sorry?
I can't type it again.
No, I know.
I saw it.
Unfortunately, it's in the Zoom netherverse somewhere. But yeah, he's writing for from a particular context. A lot of it's his experience being Black. But he does invoke in the book, which you wouldn't get from the context because he doesn't necessarily say it in the videos, but of just the importance of learning from other experiences, the Latin American experience in this country, Asian American, not to privilege one or the other, but certainly there is, I think there is an invitation as folks identifying as white to reckon with what our place in all of that is. It's not to privilege one experience over the other. The question about, reconciling, when were we ever, he does address that. And it's more to say, it's not that the concept of reconciliation is not about getting back to some era when we got it right. I mean, you're right. I mean, humanity has been, going to great lengths in every era of history to do harm to one another. Cultures everywhere. I mean, that's been the story yesterday, today. But what he talks about is the fact that reconciliation is and the call to pursue that. It's not to get back to some ideal that has existed, but it's to get back, or in some ways, it's to model what the biblical vision for the flourishing of life is from the very beginning, when God created humanity in God's image. And then if we look even forward to the story, in Revelation, when it talks about, I just did the women's circle this month, so this is fresh in my head, of the end of lament, when the new heavens and the new earth are created, and there is this reality that God will fully dwell with humanity. There will be no more tears, no more death. I've got to add to that list, no more violence done to one another because of the color of skin, because of the differing experiences. So I think reconciliation is a vision for us theologically that really begins the story in the Bible, and it gives us the vision for where it's going. It's not about, let's get back to the 19 whatever, or the 18 or the 7, I mean, that doesn't exist. You're right. And I think, he would say that. So maybe just last question, and just because we took a little bit to get back together, just, was there any thoughts of here that you kind of took away, and like, what, I think this is something that I can do, this is something that I can apply in my life? Maybe there's coworkers or neighbors that maybe you've felt you felt a nudge to try to get out of your comfort zone a little bit. Were there any just things of practical wisdom that you will take from this, Sue?
I would say that I very much kind of resonated with find your community or make one.
Mm-hmm.
And I found my community of Westminster, and I am very fortunate that I have another community now. We meet on Saturday nights at 6. Sometimes our discussions on racism and our personal experiences last up to 2 hours. And we have decided to continue to meet monthly to help encourage each other, lift each other up, exchange information, and invite others into the group whenever possible. And circling back to Westminster with some of our thoughts and ideas, and that was I float on air for hours after our discussions. They're so real and so life-changing and perspective changing. So that's something that I found helpful.
Thank you. Any other comments before we wrap up? Yeah, I think just some words that I think, maybe some overarching words from both of these chapters. Humility, certainly, and relationship, and I like the idea of starting where you are, and looking at, probably if we took a hard look at our lives and where we are, there might be more opportunities than we would think to maybe develop some of these relationships. I mean, Rachel and I were just talking about, not exactly in this context, but we have some very dear friends that are moving out of state, and we've been getting together with them once a month forever, and since college, and just kind of thinking like, oh, like how will we find that, and the more we talked about, like, there's actually like people that we connect with, and like it's not so insurmountable, if we're willing to to be led, and to willing to be humble, and to open ourselves up for some of those conversations. So I have to run over to the sanctuary for something, let me offer just a closing prayer. I don't know if anyone's able to stand, if anyone has any further comments. If I leave, I don't think I will kick everyone out, but anyway, let me offer a closing word. God, thank you for today. Thank you for this, just both of these chapters and both of these videos, for all that they invite us to ponder and to reflect on. Help us in our lives to be people who would be hospitable in how we interact with our neighbors, with the folks that we work with. And that includes people that have all different kinds of experiences and different from our own. Cultivate a spirit of humility in each of us, an openness to learn, and the commitment and the endurance to love, even when conversations get difficult, and even when it gets hard. We pray all this in Christ's name. Amen.